And joining me as a very special guest today, we have the host of China in Focus, Tiffany Meier. She gets a ton of views on her channel. Be sure to check it out when you have time. Now, the reason I asked you here today, Tiff, is maybe you could shed some light on this Putin-Xi visit. You know, China coined the trip as a peace mission. I wonder, is that all it is? If not, what's the deeper message here? Or maybe a bit of both?
Well, I think Xi Jinping definitely needs like a cover for this trip because there is a lot riding on it. There's a lot of eyes on it. The U.S. is watching very closely. And so under this guise of diplomacy or peace talks, it's a way to get into the country and not raise so many eyebrows. At that same time, though, there is a lot of concern because China is basically Russia's only lifeline. They're the ones who've been providing a lot of economic help to Russia, especially with all of the Western sanctions. So that's a huge focus. On the talk of peace talks, you know, the U.S. is very concerned because is this meeting going to end up with China sending weapons or selling weapons to Russia? There's already been some reports about that, with Russia using Chinese ammunition in the Ukraine war. Or if Beijing, if Xi Jinping actually secures a peace talk or a ceasefire, would it just be where Russian troops remain in the parts of Ukraine that they've already occupied, in which case, you know, Zelensky, Ukraine's president, would probably not be happy about that. And the U.S. is really not about that because that would also signal to the world that China is a peacemaker, right? This trip does come on the heels of China brokering this peace deal between the Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, who were big enemies, basically. And so with that, Xi Jinping is trying to get this kind of world prestige, being seen as that. And ultimately, it's not about peace, though. It's about power, because if he does get that, it boosts him on the world stage and pushes the U.S. down. So there's a lot on this trip.
Now, let me read you a quote that came out of this meeting today. Quote, a new blueprint for China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination in the years to come. My question to you is, what does it mean? Break it down for us.
Well, like we saw last year, right before the Beijing Winter Olympics, Russia and China signed this no limits friendship. And I think we're seeing a continuation of that. These countries are very, very close. You're seeing the former Undersecretary of State Keith Cross call them the totalitarian twins. You're seeing these two countries move very closely together. But as it moves further forward, it seems that Russia is growing more and more reliant on China, whether that's economically or in all these different aspects. And that is quite concerning to the world to see what would happen if Xi Jinping is the one calling all the shots in terms of Vladimir Putin.
So I suspect there will be plenty more economic cooperation after this meeting. And we know a strong economy is really the foundation of a country. But what do you think is the end game here with this cooperation?
Well, with China, it's actually quite interesting because if you look at both Russia and China, their economies have not been doing that well, especially with Russia in terms of the sanctions. With China, you're seeing Xi Jinping, after he secured his third term, he's really pushing the ideological rhetoric side. So that's kind of a return to Mao Zedong, the founding member of the Communist Party. That's really moving away from Deng Xiaoping, who opened up China and was putting in all these reforms, which really opened up the markets and put a lot of money in. So in terms of the economy, China's economy isn't doing that well. And they're actually really needing the U.S. or Western money to come in. But that's, you know, kind of been drying up, especially after the pandemic, the 3 years of lockdowns. You're seeing a lot of companies, especially, say, Apple, moving their manufacturing out, maybe to India or Vietnam, these other countries. And so going forward with this cooperation, it's going to be interesting to see how these countries actually end up. Do they actually grow their economies, or is it all on talks, right? Because you're seeing kind of the new prime minister, the new vice premier in China, Li Qiang, talking about opening up, but he is a Xi Jinping loyalist. And Xi Jinping is not talking about opening up internally. So what that means for the U.S., right? It's like, well, are investors going to buy that? Are they going to start pouring money into China, which is actually going to help the Chinese Communist Party? And all of that money will end up funding their military and could eventually down the line be used against Americans in an actual war. So there's a lot riding on that.
And you touched on this point a little bit earlier. We know that Moscow has become increasingly dependent on Beijing for its economy. And when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine, do you feel that it's also in China's interest for this war to end? Because as well, we've heard reports that China could be supporting this war in some way or another, and it could be putting a strain, if you will, on China's economy.
Well, in terms of ending the war, that would help Beijing if they are the ones who call for the peace talks or the ceasefire, because that would boost their presence on the world stage. But it would be, not good in terms of NATO then having enough power to reassemble themselves and work on the next big threat, which would be communist China. So what a lot of experts have been telling us, especially recently, is that China would actually want this war to continue, especially if Xi Jinping wanted to go after Taiwan, because in that case, the U.S. would be faced with the prospect of fighting two wars on two fronts, right? There's a lot of money we're pouring into Ukraine right now to help Ukraine. If Taiwan comes under attack, what would happen then? Do we have enough resources to go to both sides, right? So in that aspect, a lot of people are thinking Xi Jinping would want this war to continue so that he can focus on taking over Taiwan, which communist China has always seen as part of their own, even though they've never ruled Taiwan. So that's, a lot of things up in the air right now.
And let me just get your thoughts on one more thing. There's been a lot of media coverage on this visit. I think it was no accident. So what should the West take away from this? How should the West be reacting?
Well, I think right now there's a lot on the line, right? The West should be using a lot of caution going forward because there could be a shift in world balances. Most countries have turned to the U.S. in terms of, settling disputes and things, but we are seeing Beijing really kind of garnering that spot on the world stage, especially after the Saudi-Iran deal. The focus on what happened in Afghanistan has made a lot of U.S. allies concerned recently. And so with the U.S., you're seeing, is the U.S. still really the most powerful, right? Is the U.S. still able to convince other countries that it is still the most powerful country on the world? Or are some of the closer countries in Asia, especially Asian countries to China, starting to think maybe China could be that one? So there's a lot there, and a lot of it is riding on the U.S. leadership and what that leadership is doing and the message that's being sent out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But thank you very much today for coming on the show. It was a pleasure speaking to you, Tiffany.
It's an honor to be here.